What's up guys, it's Smith. Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about bosses. Now, before this video starts, I just want to say, hey, my name is Hytale. I've been covering Hytale on and off pretty much since the game was announced. So if you're interested in Hytale at all, be sure to subscribe and, hit the notification bell if you're a real one. I also want to say that everything in this video is speculation based off existing information about the game and what we can infer from other games in similar genres. So without further ado, let's get right into it. What is a boss? A boss is usually a big guy who is very hard to take down, has a lot of health, and is often very rewarding. They can be found in a lot of places, but most commonly, they are usually at the end of major long linear encounters. Now, what about the types of bosses? Well, first off, there's world bosses. World bosses are kind of bosses that spawn randomly in and around the world. These aren't often bosses that you can go out and pursue for their reward specifically, but they kind of spawn randomly. So when you encounter them in the open world, you kind of have the option whether or not you want to pursue them for their rewards. There's risk that you could be taken out by them, but there's also a very high reward for just going out and exploring. It's another reason to explore the world, and I touched on them a bit in my Exploration Hytale video if you want to learn more about exploration, but they're a really interesting and nice way to kind of spice up your gameplay as you're just wondering about doing menial tasks. Next up, story bosses. Story bosses usually come from the linear story. I do assume that Hytale will have a linear story quest, and we will learn more and more about these enemies, about these villains as we progress through it. And that build up through the story is a really good way of introducing bosses because it adds a lot of stakes, it adds a lot of excitement, and it makes it feel really nice taking these guys down, especially when you know everything that they've done and all the bad things they've done. Taking them out feels really good, and there's usually a ton of build up over a long story. If Farron still ends up being in the game in some form, I am sure later on down the story, probably quite far down the story, we may end up fighting him as a boss fight. That'll be really interesting, that'll be really cool, and I really want to see what his mechanics are. Next up, dungeon bosses. Dungeon bosses usually take place, believe it or not, in dungeons. Ain't that crazy? Dungeons in other games are these long linear killing experiences where you just walk down, kill mobs, and it's usually not randomly generated. It's very linear, it's very planned, and they usually look quite nice. We have seen dungeons in Hytale from concept art and from them being mentioned a lot of times. In dungeons in pretty much all games that have them, have bosses in them, whether one big one at the end or many scattered throughout with one big one at the end. It's going to be really interesting because with each dungeon, they kind of have to create original bosses. There's probably going to be a lot of variety just in the dungeons alone, and that'll be really interesting. Next up, Ultiverse bosses. In my Ultiverses video, I kind of mentioned how there will be harder versions of the base Orbis zones, but with more challenge and kind of the best rewards in the entire game, and Ultiverses will be unlocked much later in the story. They're kind of an extra avenue for skill progression, but Ultiverse bosses specifically, I think will be extremely challenging. You will acquire the best loot, the best consumables, the best gear, and they will be extremely difficult to take down. But they will probably give the best stuff in the entire game. That's going to be crazy. I can't wait for that. Next up, structure bosses. We've seen a lot of examples of this, and I think one of the examples we can point to a lot is the Goblin King we've seen so many screenshots of. In the original Hytale trailer, we could see the guy walking into a door and into a room full of goblins. I think that's going to be a randomly generated structure inside of Orbis, and you're going to be able to walk through there, take out the mobs, kind of similar to a dungeon, but instead of going through a portal to do that dungeon, and it's completely separate from Orbis, I think structures with their bosses will be randomly spawned inside Orbis itself, and you'll be able to randomly stumble onto them, which is really cool. These are kind of like world bosses in that they spawn in Orbis, just in the world, and you can interact with them, but I think they're going to be different mechanically, because they're not going to be completely random. They will be random where they are in the world, their location, but they're not going to randomly spawn. When you see an entrance to a door, you'll probably know that there's a boss out there every single time. Now we can assume what the bosses are. Who are they? Well, I think bosses are going to tie in to the reputation system. Let's say, for example, Zone 1 with the Quebecs and the Trorks, right? If we start killing Quebecs or burning them, for example, I think the Trorks are probably going to like us quite a lot and kind of introduce us to their clan in the main story sense. And I think that choice ultimately can lead to us being in conflict with the Quebecs and eventually unlocking bosses that kind of like a big tree boss, for example. Maybe they've had enough, or the Chalks want to go in and destroy their core. I'm making stuff up, but in order to do that, we fight a big tree boss, for example. But it's just complete waffle, but something like that, you know? The choices we make ultimately lead to what bosses we fight. I don't think they're going to be that varied in difficulty. Like, I think both paths are kind of going to be not massively substantial in terms of loot and gear and like difference, but kind of more just tie into the story and moral sense of the whole thing. But I do think the choices we make will alter the main story, if not ultimately with between Gaia and Varen, that whole thing, but like the small stories. So if we end up siding with one side of a zone's races, then we'll have to fight the other side, and we'll have to fight them, and that could ultimately mean we fight some different bosses depending on our playthrough and our choices in the story. And one way we know that races are going to have this specific bosses is this Outlander boss who we've seen here, this big guy who's kind of walking up and beats the camera down, you know. That is very clearly an Outlander boss, and I really wonder whether all of the races are going to be different and have their own little systems and little mobs. That could be a massive point of variation for the game. On one hand, you could be playing the same game, but if you choose to side with a different faction or a different race, you could just have entirely different encounters, different bosses, all sorts of that. That could be crazy. Also, with our example from the Goblin King boss, I also do think other races kind of around the world will have their own bosses as well. Based off the example with the Goblin King alone, I think all these smaller races that we see running around may have their own more important bosses that we can encounter, probably randomly scattered around their world in structures. Now, what about mechanics? Mechanics are kind of interesting because this game is procedural. Unless each and every boss room is identical, you're going to have to design mechanics around the procedural generation, which I think means that a lot of the bosses are probably just going to fire projectiles at you, and they're probably going to swing at you. I don't think it's going to be anything major or massive or really innovative. The mechanics, like the dodging and the damage and all that, and the buffs and debuffs they apply to you, maybe like not being able to jump and you having to avoid different attacks, just like that stuff we see in other games is going to be really kind of standard. I don't think the bosses are going to be that engaging in terms of mechanics. It's just going to more, the interest is going to be tying into the story. It's not going to be too crazy. Now, what about rewards? Well, as I said, rewards are going to be the best of the best, especially if you're like progressing through a story quest and you know you've beaten this really tough boss. If you get nothing, then it's kind of gonna feel a bit crap. Okay, you're gonna be like, ooh, give me that sword. You know, you got a really cool, you know, the fire sword, for example. Maybe kill a fire snake or a fire dragon or something like that. You get the fire sword, but in the clip they just showed that you're getting the fire sword out the chest in the place. I don't know. Okay, ignore the fire sword one, but like really cool, big, important stuff. Like a lot of dungeons and bosses in other games have specific rewards with percent chances of dropping. Maybe we see that in Hytale, but percentage chance of dropping and like loot tables and stuff, that kind of depends on whether or not the bosses respawn at all. But even so, I definitely think the bosses are going to drop the best of the best loot in the game, and you're really going to want to pursue that. Anyways, guys, that's going to be it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a like if you liked it, leave a dislike if you disliked it. I'll probably work on a video about dungeons tomorrow, talking a bit about dungeons and other games. Tap out. Peace. See ya.